The chapel stood hidden beneath a canopy of pine and fog, its stones slick with moss, its roof sagging under centuries of rot and rain. It had once been a place of light, a refuge carved into the edge of the forest for weary travelers and old farmers with calloused hands. Now it was barely more than a ruin, forgotten by maps, remembered only by rumor. There were no candles lit inside, no psalms whispered into the rafters. Only the cold breath of early dawn, pressing against the wooden door like a warning, and someone barely more than a shadow trembling near the altar. She knelt not in prayer, but in fear. Her cloak was soaked from the mist, her fingers locked tightly together, not out of piety, but desperation. The silence inside the chapel wasn't peaceful. It was the kind that follows a sentence, not a song, the kind that waits to be broken. Outside, the wind moved through the trees like a choir of ghosts. The forest didn't rustle, it murmured. Everything here seemed to hold its breath. Then a bell. It rang from far away, but the sound struck like thunder inside her chest. Not the bell for mass, not the gentle rhythm that called villagers to kneel and murmur their sins. This bell rang slower, heavier, with a pause between each toll, a silence that stretched like rope being pulled taut. In some parts of Europe, they called it campana de juicio, the judgment bell. It didn't summon the faithful, it summoned the condemned. She pressed her back against the altar, as if its cold stone might shield her from what was coming. But she knew better. Everyone did. Once the bell rang like that, someone had already spoken your name. It didn't matter if you were guilty. It didn't matter if you even knew what your crime was. If the wrong man whispered the right words in the ear of the church, the bell would ring and someone would burn. She wasn't a noble. She had no land to defend her, no husband to speak in her favor. She had healed a sick child once, using herbs passed down from her grandmother. That was enough. That, and the way her eyes lingered too long on the stars. That, and the story of a cat seen too often at her door. That, and the silence she held when others begged for her to deny it. Another bell rang, and with it, the woods began to move. Not with wolves, not with animals, but with men, boots cracking branches, breath turning to fog, leather scraping against steel. They weren't soldiers. They didn't need to be. They carried no flags, just ropes and torches and the weight of conviction. Inside the chapel, the air felt heavier now. Her breath came shallow, her hands trembling harder. She tried to whisper something, a prayer, a plea, perhaps a goodbye, but her voice caught in her throat. She was not a heretic. She was not a witch. She had done nothing. But none of that mattered. The church didn't burn people for what they did. It burned them for what others feared. And fear by then had become a form of faith. The third bell rang, and the door creaked open. She wasn't taken from the woods. She wasn't dragged from some dark cave muttering spells or surrounded by candles. She was taken in daylight in the middle of the market with the sun high and the smell of apples in the air. One moment she was standing near a table of dried figs, speaking softly to the merchant's wife. The next, two men in dark robes approached her, nodded once, and placed their hands on her shoulders like they were guiding a guest to dinner. She didn't resist. Neither did anyone else. No one asked why. The butcher looked up from his cleaver, blinked, then looked back down. The priest, who often stood by the well, adjusted his sash and turned away. The merchant's wife, the very woman she had just been speaking to, stepped back without a word, as if the space between them had suddenly become dangerous. Even the children stopped playing with their hoops and stones. Everyone watched, but no one spoke, because in those years, silence was safer than truth. She walked between the men without looking back. Her hands weren't tied. They didn't need to be. She walked like someone who already understood the rules and understood that they had changed. Not by law, not by decree, but by something worse. By whisper. Rumor had weight in the Middle Ages, heavier than fact, heavier than scripture. Once a whisper passed from mouth to mouth that she had stared too long into a flame, that her husband died too suddenly, that she walked alone too often at dusk. It took on shape. Then it took on fire. You didn't need to be named in court. You didn't need to be caught with a book, or a candle, or a charm. You just needed to be the wrong woman, at the wrong time, standing in the wrong light. By evening, her name had not been read aloud, but it had been written in charcoal on the back wall of the chapel. Just 5 letters, smeared beside the others. No priest signed it. No official sealed it. It wasn't on any parchment or trial scroll. It wouldn't be recorded in the town's birth ledger, nor in its death list. But everyone knew what it meant. She had no chance to speak, because once your name appeared on that wall, it no longer belonged to you. It belonged to the fire. The fire was ready before the sentence was spoken. That was always the way of it. The wood came first, dry bundles stacked like bones, bound tightly in the center of the square. The rope was prepared next, coarse and fraying, knotted by hands that had done this before. Then came the procession, slow and measured, not to shame but to sanctify. Because this, they said, was not punishment, it was purification, and the fire, not the church, would be the one to speak last. No judge announced her guilt, no parchment was read aloud, there were no witnesses brought forth, no defense offered. Her trial had taken place elsewhere, not in the courtroom, but in kitchens and confessionals, at wells and under breath. A candle had once been seen flickering in her window long after the curfew bell had rung. A child once said she had strange dreams after eating soup she made. A song she hummed something her mother taught her had a melody too close to an old pagan chant. No one could prove any of it, but no one needed to. The fire did not ask for proof. She stood at the stake with her hands bound before her, not behind. It was a small mercy, the kind they allowed women. Her eyes were open. Her dress had been stripped of color, a plain linen shift that no longer held any warmth. Someone had shaved her hair, badly, as if cutting it would sever her from whatever darkness they believed had settled inside her. A priest stood beside her, holding a crucifix, his face frozen in the strange performance of sorrow. He read a prayer in Latin, words so familiar they had lost their meaning. It was not for her. It was for the crowd, for the church, for history. A final attempt to make what was about to happen sound like something holy. But the fire didn't speak in Latin. The fire had its own tongue. When the torch was brought near, there was a pause. A moment of breath held by everyone in the square. Then the flame kissed the edge of the kindling, and the crackling began. It started low, soft as dry leaves beneath a boot. Then it grew louder, higher, hungrier. The smoke curled around her ankles like a serpent remembering its master. And still, she didn't scream. It was the fire that screamed. It howled into the morning, sending birds flying from the chapel roof, making horses snort and pull against their reins. It licked up the wood, then the rope, then the hem of her shift. The people watched, mouths open but silent. As the flames did what no priest had the courage to do, they condemned without hesitation. And when the fire roared its final sermon, no one asked why she burned. They only whispered, "She must have done something," because that was easier than admitting no one truly knew. He came without fanfare. No trumpet, no banner, no parchment-bearing royal seal, just a black horse, a darker robe, and silence riding beside him like a shadow. The villagers knew he was coming long before they saw him. Birds stopped nesting in the bell tower. The butcher's dog refused to bark. Mothers whispered to their children in tones too soft to be prayers, too cold to be lullabies. The road into the village twisted through fields of barley and ash, and for days, the smoke from the last burning still clung to the stones. The inquisitor did not speak when he arrived. He did not dismount in front of the church. He simply stood, tall and still, like a figure carved from soot. His face was long, unreadable, half sunken in the hood that drooped over his brow like a cowl of judgment. His eyes, when they emerged from shadow, were not cruel. That would have been easier. They were worse calm, detached. The kind of eyes that did not need to hate in order to destroy. One by one, the villagers gathered in the square, not by command, but by instinct, like deer drawn to the scent of a fire, not knowing whether it would warm them or consume them. No one looked directly at him. Men fidgeted with their caps. Women kept their hands busy twisting the hems of their aprons. Even the priest, old and usually too proud to bow to anyone but God, lowered his head and muttered a greeting that never reached the inquisitor's ears. Children, who normally played near the well, had vanished into doorways. The bravest of them, a boy no older than 8, peeked through a gap in the shutters, wide-eyed. His mother pulled him back without a word. The inquisitor said nothing for an hour. He stood, listening. To what, none could say. The creak of the mill, the flutter of laundry, the pulse of the village itself. Finally, he walked. Not quickly, not slowly, but with a purpose so exact it felt preordained. With each step, it was as if the cobblestones rearranged themselves to accommodate him. People parted like wheat beneath the scythe. His footsteps didn't echo, they landed like verdicts. He entered the church, alone, no guards, no scribes, no entourage, just that robe that swept the dust in his wake. The wooden door groaned shut behind him, and for a moment the air in the village thickened. Even the sun, which had shone all morning, slipped behind a thin gray cloud. Inside, he would ask for names. Not out loud, not in anger, just calmly. He would ask questions that had no right answers. Have you seen her light candles alone? Have you heard her speak a word not meant for mass? Have you ever wondered why the child she touched got better, but your own did not? And outside, the villagers would begin to remember things that never happened. Because when the Inquisitor arrives, truth becomes a memory, and silence becomes a weapon. It always began with a question, soft, unassuming, almost kind. The Inquisitor never shouted. His voice never shook. Instead, he asked as if curious, as if merely collecting stories for some great and holy ledger. He sat across from them, from women with blistered hands, from midwives and millers, from widows who owned nothing but a name, and leaned in with polite interest. "Do you ever dream?" he asked one woman, her eyes hollowed by years of hunger. She nodded, careful. "Yes," she said, "sometimes." The Inquisitor smiled, not cruelly, not warmly, simply enough to make her believe she had answered well. Then came the next. "And in these dreams, do you ever see things before they happen?" Her brows furrowed. "Only once. I dreamed of my husband's death, and the next day he fell from the roof." The Inquisitor did not move. He simply made a note. And so it began. What seemed like harmless questions soon turned into a kind of quiet unraveling. No accusation was spoken, not yet. There was no shouting of witch or heretic. Instead, there was the gentle slicing of doubt, thin and precise. "Do you know the names of herbs that cure fevers? Have you ever walked in the forest alone and heard voices you could not explain? Have you ever woken with markings on your skin that you could not account for?" The questions didn't have answers, or rather, any answer could be turned against you. One man said yes, he used sage to help his daughter breathe easier at night. A week later, he was taken from his bed. A woman admitted to singing lullabies in her mother's native tongue, an old Breton chant with no meaning, just sound. They said it sounded too much like a spell. The villagers began to realize that innocence was not protection, that to speak truthfully was not to speak safely. The Inquisition did not ask in order to understand, it asked in order to frame. Every answer created a shadow. Every shadow became a space where guilt could live. A child said his mother once healed a cut with vinegar and prayer. The boy thought he was praising her. She was burned by the end of the month. Another man, a quiet woodcutter who had never learned to read, confessed he felt closest to God while walking through the trees at dusk. "Did you ever hear voices in those woods?" the inquisitor asked. "Only the wind," the man answered. That was enough. He didn't return. The questions were gentle. The answers were sincere. The punishments were absolute. People stopped speaking. They stopped admitting to dreams, to memories, to thoughts that strayed from Scripture. Mothers warned their children not to mention their songs. Old women buried their knowledge of herbs deeper than their dead. The village grew quieter, colder, and still the inquisitor asked. Because in that time, questions did not seek truth. They sought fire, and the fire always found what it was looking for. She had never held a book in her life. Her fingers were stiff with age, curled from decades of kneading dough, pulling weeds, gripping wooden pails up from the well. Letters were strange symbols to her, sacred, yes, but distant, like the stars. Scripture was something spoken aloud by men in robes, not something meant for women like her to touch. She could not read. She had never been taught. And still, when they came to take her, they called her a heretic. Her name was Marguerite. She had lived in the village since before the last plague. People used to come to her door for balm when the healer was away, or for boiled roots when the winter coughs swept through. Her home smelled of dried thyme and smoke. Her hair was silver and always tied in a neat knot behind her neck. She did not speak often, but when she did, it was slow, deliberate, and kind, a kind of kindness that made some men uncomfortable, as if they didn't quite believe someone could know so much and want nothing in return. The story began with a cat, a black one. Not hers, she never kept animals, but one that wandered freely through the village, lean and silent. On a Sunday morning, as the bells began to toll, the cat slipped into the chapel and wove its way among the pews. Some of the children giggled, the priest frowned, and Marguerite, from her place near the back, smiled. That was all it took. Someone saw it, someone remembered, someone whispered. She had smiled at a black cat during Mass, and the cat had not run from her. It had stopped, looked at her, then curled up at her feet. By evening, the whispers had teeth. By morning, they had names. The priest did not come to her door himself. The inquisitor sent a man with a cord and a parchment she could not read. She did not resist. She folded her apron, tied it neatly around her waist, and stepped outside barefoot. They asked her questions she didn't understand. Had she ever spoken charms into her food? Had she ever healed without invoking Christ's name? Had she ever marked the lintels of her door with herbs or salts? Her answers, soft, confused, genuine, only deepened their certainty. She said she often used rosemary to clean her floor because it left a sweet smell. She said when her neighbors were ill, she sometimes sat beside their beds and hummed old lullabies from her childhood. She said the cat had simply been tired. None of that mattered. They accused her of keeping forbidden texts, of chanting in secret, of consorting with spirits. When she told them she couldn't read, one of the scribes remarked coldly, "That is no defense. The devil speaks to the heart, not the eye." They did not search her home. They didn't need to. Her smile had been enough. She was burned on a gray morning, with frost still clinging to the eaves. No family claimed her. No name was carved into stone. The black cat was never seen again. And long after the fire had died, the villagers still spoke of her in hushed tones, not out of guilt, but because they feared her more in memory than they ever had in life. Let me know when you'd like to continue with Part 7, The Trial of Ash, and I'll carry the voice forward. There was no courtroom, no bench of impartial men, no scroll of rights or laws read aloud before a solemn assembly. The trial took place in the chapel, the very space meant to offer sanctuary, with its cold stone floor and crucifix looming overhead like a silent judge. The pews had been pushed to the sides, their polished wood now stained and warped from damp and use. In the center stood a single chair, heavy, splintered, bolted to the floor, not for comfort, for control. Around it, the Inquisition's tools lay carefully arranged on a table: iron tongs, clamps, a branding rod, a vial of oil, a small brazier filled with coals. This was not a court. This was a ritual. She was brought in barefoot, arms bound loosely, not yet broken but already hollow. The room reeked of burnt cloth and rust. The air hung thick with the scent of fear, not fresh panic, but the stale, clinging odor of terror that had long since settled into the stones. The scribes sat with quills poised, their ink already wet. The inquisitor stood behind her, not looking at her, but at the altar, as though waiting for the right breath of silence to begin. There was no accusation read aloud, no clear charge, only the suggestion of heresy which, in those years, meant whatever the church needed it to mean: speaking too softly, knowing too much, healing without scripture, crying at the wrong time, a woman who asked too many questions or didn't ask enough, a girl who walked through the woods at dusk, a widow who prayed with her eyes open. Heresy was a net woven wide and cast blindly. It caught everything and everyone it needed to. They asked her, gently at first, if she would confess. She said she didn't understand what she'd done. They asked again, more firmly. She said she had done nothing. Then came the fire, not of the pyre, but of the iron. The tongs were removed from the brazier, their tips glowing faintly red in the dim light. The inquisitor did not shout. He did not rage. He only repeated the same question: "Do you confess?" She screamed once, then bit down on her tongue hard enough to bleed. They called that silence an admission. They called her pain a sign of guilt. And when her body finally gave in, when the room tilted and her voice cracked into something no longer human, they leaned close to catch the fragments of what she mumbled through bloodied teeth. It didn't matter what she said. The words didn't have to make sense. The important thing was that she said them. The confession was written down in neat Latin, signed not by her but on her behalf, and sealed with the mark of a court that had never truly existed. The trial had lasted less than a day. The sentence had already been prepared. Outside, the pyre had been stacked while she screamed. The rope had been soaked. The crowd was gathering. And as they led her away, barely conscious, her feet dragging through the dirt, no one asked what she had done. No one needed to. The trial was not for justice. It was for fire. And the fire had already spoken. She was no older than 7 barefoot, dirt-caked knees, and hair tangled from sleep that came too late and ended too soon. The morning she was taken from her cot, the sun hadn't yet risen. Her village still slept under a veil of ash and dew. 2 men in robes, one soft-voiced, the other silent, stood in her doorway. They didn't shout. They didn't need to. The fear had already been planted in her days ago, when whispers crept into their hut at night like rats. That the church was watching, that questions were dangerous, that some people were not safe anymore. One of those people was her mother. The girl had watched, days before, as her mother pressed herbs into cloth and prayed not with folded hands, but with her palms against the earth. She had seen her mother give bread to the coughing man who slept behind the well, even though the priest said the sickness was God's punishment. Her mother had always looked up when the bells rang, but she never crossed herself. Now the girl stood before a table in the village hall, surrounded by figures she didn't know, robes too clean, hands too still. They spoke softly, kindly even, asking if she remembered what her mother did in the evenings. Did she speak strange words? Did she ever tell you not to go near the priest? Did she ever whisper to you about the moon? The girl shook her head, but the questions came again, this time firmer. Then came the threats, not shouted, just rearranged into possibilities. If you don't help, child, the sickness will find you too. If you don't speak, they'll think you were part of it, And if you lie, well, then God will know. She cried when she finally pointed, not because she understood what she had done, but because something inside her broke the part that knew her mother's touch, the part that still smelled the broth simmering from the night before. Her hand rose, slow and shaking, and in that one gesture, a line was drawn in history, not between good and evil, but between belief and terror. Her mother was arrested that afternoon. No trial, no last confession. She was burned at dusk while the bells rang louder than usual. The crowd gathered. The girl stood among them, clutching the edge of her tunic with fingers raw from cold and shame. No one looked at her. No one comforted her. No one said her name. In the records, there is no mention of a daughter, only that the accused confessed to pagan practices, named by a witness of pure soul. She did not speak again for years, and when she did, her first words were, "I didn't mean to." They said that when a heretic burns, the smoke rises to heaven, and the sky becomes clean again. That the fire consumes not just the body, but the blasphemy, the rot, the invisible stain upon the soul of the village. They said that each rising column of ash was a prayer answered in flame, a dark sacrifice to keep the light pure. And so the people gathered, as they always did, shivering not from grief, but from the cold, wet air that pressed low upon the field just beyond the chapel wall. But that day, the sky did not open in blessing. It closed in refusal. A storm had been whispering at the edge of the valley since morning, and by the time the kindling cracked beneath the woman's feet, the clouds had gathered like a judgment older than any priest. Rain began to fall, not a torrent, not a flood, just a steady weeping that soaked the hem of every robe and turned the ashes at the base of the stake to dark sludge. The fire struggled. Flames hissed and bent sideways, licking at the wood with tongues too weak to swallow. Then came the wind. It turned, not out toward the hills, not upward into the judgment seat of God, but back. Back across the field, back across the crowd, back into the faces of the men who lit the fire. Smoke curled into their nostrils, thick and bitter, smelling not of incense or sanctity, but of hair, of flesh, of wet wool and scorched linen. It clung to their robes, it stung their eyes, and for the first time, the executioner coughed. He did not speak. He had done this before. He had lit stakes in 4 villages, 5 if you count the girl, but never had the wind turned. Never had the fire hesitated, as if the wood itself were unwilling. The priest raised his hand, tried to chant the Latin blessing louder, but the words faltered in his throat. Not because he doubted, because he choked. The smoke had gotten into his mouth, filled it like a lie too long untold. Behind him, one of the boys who had helped prepare the site turned pale and wretched into the grass. No one moved to stop the execution. The woman screamed only once, a sound sharp and short, almost swallowed by the wind, then silence. Only the wet hiss of fire dying slower than expected. When it was over, and the crows began to circle low, someone tried to reignite the pyre. The priest insisted it must be fully done, that the remains be reduced, but no flame would hold. The kindling was soaked. The sky had sealed shut. Later that night, they would say the smoke had returned to them because it had nowhere else to go. That heaven, perhaps, had not accepted the offering. And in the silence that followed, no one said the woman's name. She didn't scream, not once, not even when the fire caught her dress, not even when the ropes tightened as her body shrank away from the heat. There were no prayers on her lips, no last words to etch into the memories of the crowd, just silence. Her silence sharp, deliberate, and heavier than any sermon the priest could give. The village called her a witch, but what unsettled them most was not her herbs or the cat that slept on her thatch roof. It was this, that she knew what they would do to her and still looked at them without blinking. Some said she was mute, but she wasn't. She had once sung lullabies to the miller's boy when his mother died of fever. She had once shouted down a magistrate when he tried to take her firewood in the winter. No, her silence now was not absence. It was resistance. As the fire climbed her legs and smoke curled into her hair, she didn't close her eyes. They say she looked straight ahead, not up, not at the sky like a soul surrendering, but straight at the people, into them, and her gaze did not flinch. An old man, who once bought salves from her for his aching knees, was there. He could not stop shaking, not from fear of her, but from the memory of her kindness. A girl, just 12, clutched her mother's sleeve and whispered, "Is she smiling?" Her mother said nothing. Later, in years when the church bell fell silent and the crops withered too soon, they would remember that face the way the corners of her mouth had curved upward, barely perceptible through the smoke. They would remember it not as madness, but as something worse, something they could not explain, something that turned the night colder. The priest had said she must burn because she consorted with demons, because she healed with things not taught in Scripture. But in truth, it was not her knowledge that condemned her, it was her composure, her refusal to perform the part of the guilty, her refusal to cry when they needed her tears to justify what they were doing. She gave them none, and so, even after the ashes blew into the fields, even after her cottage was pulled apart stone by stone, her silence remained. Long after her name was forbidden to be spoken, her smile haunted the winter air. They burned her to erase her, but it was her silence that stayed. The fire was not satisfied. It never was. After the woman with no words was reduced to soot and cinder, the flames seemed to linger in the air longer than they should have, refusing to disperse, clinging to the wooden beams, to the chapel's candlelight, to the cloth of the villagers' sleeves. It was as if the fire had memory, and memory, once awakened, is a dangerous thing. They say it started with a sigh, a soft, almost imperceptible exhale carried by the wind, brushing the ear of the tanner as he closed his shop. Then, that night, he dreamt of fire not engulfing his house, but spelling out his name in glowing embers across his yard. In the morning, his neighbors noticed he no longer spoke. His hands trembled too violently to work leather, and when the priest came to bless his door, the man vomited ash. He was the next to burn. They said he confessed to heresy in a voice barely his own. Then it was the midwife, then the brewer, then the boy who once delivered figs to the convent. One by one they came forward, not out of guilt, but as if summoned. They dreamt of smoke curling through their windows, of their names scratched in soot across the floorboards, of flames whispering from the hearth, "We remember you." None of them could say why. Some swore they had done nothing. Others wept in confusion, begging to be told what sin had brought this. But the fire needed no proof. It moved like a rumor in the night, a superstition clothed in certainty. The villagers whispered of a curse, of devils planted beneath the church's stones, but no one dared ask what lit the torch in the inquisitor's hand. Because what if it wasn't the devil? What if it was justice with a blindfold made of fear? Each time the flames rose, the crowd drew back further. Children were told to stay indoors. Elders feigned illness. But it did not stop the procession. Every week, the bell tolled. Every week, someone else stood on the platform, unable to say when they had been accused or by whom. Some came on their own. Some were dragged, dazed and barefoot, mumbling verses to themselves as though trying to erase something only they could hear. The fire had no voice, and yet it spoke. Through dreams, through coughs, through the echo of crackling wood behind shut doors. And though it never said a word aloud, its message was clear. You do not need to be guilty, only noticed, only remembered. And once remembered, you would burn. They found it beneath the floorboards of an abandoned shed near the edge of the village. The wood had softened with rot, swollen from years of rain sneaking through the broken roof. But one of the boys who chased rats there had stepped wrong, and the board gave way. Underneath, wrapped in old cloth, stiffened by mildew and time, was a book. It was not a thick book, not like the Bibles the priest kept under lock and altar, but it was bound in black hide, and its pages, though speckled with mold, were covered in a script no one recognized. The letters were sharp and flowing, like vines of ink crawling in patterns that seemed to shift when the eye lingered too long. There were drawings, too, not of saints or angels, but of symbols that made the chapel's windows seem suddenly fragile and the crucifix feel too small. No one could read it. Not the priest, who turned pale and silent. Not the elders who crossed themselves and refused to touch it. But that didn't matter. The book had been hidden, and that was enough. The mere fact that it existed outside their knowing meant it belonged to the dark. And whoever had hidden it must have had something to hide from. Within hours, they had dragged old Marcion from his cottage at the edge of the trees. He was a quiet man, near blind, with twisted fingers and a mouth full of whispers. Years ago, they'd called him Healer. Then later, they stopped calling him anything at all. He spoke little, saw less, and hurt no one, but he lived close to where the book was found. And that was enough. They said he mumbled in his sleep, that he boiled things late at night, that his chimney smoked too long after sunset, that once years ago a child stopped coughing after he gave her a tincture, that he'd read a book once, long ago, that he had once owned a cat that never meowed. None of this proved anything. But in that season, evidence was a luxury, fear was currency, and silence was as good as confession. They bound Marcion's hands in front of the church and held the book up before him. "Is this yours?" they asked, though they did not want an answer. He shook his head. A child cried in the crowd. Someone whispered, "He knows the tongue it's written in." No one asked how they knew. The next morning, the book was burned. But not before they forced Marcion to touch every page, to smear his thumb across each line, so they could say he had read it. And when the ashes were carried off by the wind, the people thought they were done with it. But books do not die easily, and ideas even unread can take root in soil soaked with fear. Marcion burned too, 3 nights later, without ever having read a word. She was not born to fire. She was born to silence, to the quiet hum of bees over lavender fields, to the hush of mortar grinding dried petals in stone. Her name was Eloise, but no one called her that anymore. In the village, they had shortened it into whispers, a hiss spoken only behind hands. Her, just her, the woman with herbs, the one who lived near the riverbank, where the fog curled low in the mornings and birds refused to sing after dusk. Eloise knew the forest better than most priests knew scripture. She could tell the difference between belladonna and wild violet with her eyes closed, could make a poultice from things that grew under frost, could ease a birth with a single pinch of powder. For years, they brought her baskets, eggs, bread, buttons, even coins in exchange for roots and tinctures, for chants spoken low over fevers and bruised lungs. And when the sick rose from their beds, the villagers nodded quietly and never looked her in the eye. But when the child died, the boy with hair like wheat and a name, the records forgot no one knocked on her door. They knocked on each other's people. First with sorrow, then with suspicion, and finally with torches. The mother said she had brought the child to Eloise when the fever started. The father said he'd heard a chant, not a prayer, from outside the window. And the midwife, who had long resented being replaced by herbs and dust, said she once saw Eloise breathe over the child's lips. She said the boy had stopped crying just after that. She said the woman had drawn the breath out. The villagers no longer needed proof. They needed a reason. And in a world ruled by invisible sins and holy terror, reasons did not need to make sense. They only needed to soothe fear, to explain why a child, so close to God, had vanished while the woman in the shadows still walked. They found her tending to thyme and crushed wild clover when they came. She didn't resist, she didn't plead. Perhaps she had seen it in the leaves. Perhaps she had long known that a woman who healed too many would one day be blamed for those she couldn't. They tied her wrists with ropes soaked in salt to keep her spells from slipping out. They placed her in the church cellar, beneath dripping stone and iron crosses, where she slept with rats and the names they called her: witch, thief of breath, servant of rot. At her trial, they asked her if she had spoken with spirits. She said yes, the spirit of the earth, of the moon, of the sap that runs through bark and bone. They asked her if she had cursed the child. She wept and said no. They asked her if she believed in the church. She said she believed in healing. They asked her if she would repent. She said, for which part, the help or the herbs? The next morning they burned her under a sky smeared with ash. Her screams were brief, but the scent of thyme, sweet and bitter, lingered far longer. And though they claimed to destroy every root she had touched, wild clover still grows near the riverbank, no matter how many times they dig it up. The morning she burned, no bells rang, no chants echoed down the nave, no priest stepped outside. The church stood silent, tall and clean, its doors shut fast like a sealed mouth refusing to speak mercy. Behind them a statue of the Virgin Mary, arms open wide but eyes carved in stone, and beyond her, the altar where candles still flickered for the souls of kings and martyrs, but not for her. They said the condemned were unfit to enter the house of God, that their presence stained the floor, that their breath soured the incense. But even in chains, they turned their heads toward the church, always the same, as if expecting a door to creak open, as if still waiting, like children who had knocked too softly. Some whispered Latin prayers under their breath, mangled but desperate. Others didn't speak at all, but all of them looked. And the church, she never looked back. There was a rule, written in the corners of canon law, that once a soul was judged heretic, the house of salvation was no longer theirs. Not for confession, not for refuge, not even for shelter from the storm. The building that had baptized them now turned to stone, unmoved by flame or flesh. And so they stood in the square, straw at their feet, faces tilted to the sky or to the spire above it. Some cried, some trembled, some gritted their teeth. But many, far too many, simply watched the church door. A few dared ask, what if they repented now? What if the sinner's heart cracked open only at the edge of fire? Would he still hear them through the stone? Would the Virgin still lift her carved hand not in judgment, but in welcome? There are records of one man, bound and blistered, who screamed as the fire climbed his legs, "Let me in." The guards thought he meant the pain. The priest, watching from a high window, knew better. The door stayed closed. The church did not burn anyone. That's what they would say. We do not shed blood. That was the phrase. And so, they handed the condemned to secular authorities, who lit the flame, but the accused knew the truth. The door had closed long before the fire was lit. It was not the torch that exiled them, it was the silence. And that silence stretched like shadow across cities, across borders, across generations. People learned to lower their voices, to doubt their own tongues, to check the shape of their thoughts before they spoke. But even centuries later, in dusty records and broken testimonies, you will find that detail again and again. They turned to face the church, even when their faces blistered, even when their eyes melted, because some part of them still believed the door would open. It never did. He did not raise his voice. He was not a protester, not a rebel, not a threat. He was a monk, quiet, thin, and always barefoot, even when the frost cracked the stones of the abbey floor. His name was Brother Alaric, and the only thing he ever dared to challenge was the weight of unnecessary suffering. He believed in God. That was never the question. He whispered prayers before he spoke to anyone else each day. He tended the gardens with psalms on his lips and tears in his eyes when the violets bloomed too early and died too fast. He believed that grace was not earned, but given, and that mercy did not come from the threat of fire. The trouble began with a sermon. It was not even public. A few novices, a damp chapel, and the soft patter of rain on the glassless windows. He said, almost in passing, that God needs no blood to forgive. The sacrifice was made once. Not again, not in this square, not with these ropes. One novice, eyes wide, repeated it to the prior. The prior, fearing scandal, told the bishop. And 3 days later, before the sun fully rose, they came for Alaric. He was still kneeling when they entered his cell. He did not resist. He bowed his head. He asked only one thing, "May I finish this prayer?" They let him. It was short. In the square, they told the crowd he had denied the necessity of justice, that he sought to make sin light, that he mocked the sacrifice of the saints. But those who had known him, the cook, the librarian, the young gardener, said nothing. They watched as he was tied upright with a calmness that frightened even the guards. A priest approached him one last time. "Confess," the man said, voice trembling more than he expected. "Recant your error, and you may die clean." Alaric looked up at the clouds and shook his head. "Not in defiance, in mourning. I only said that he is kinder than we are." Those were his last words. The flames were slow that morning. The wood was wet. The smoke curled and clung, and the crows above the steeple did not scatter. Some in the crowd wept, not because they agreed with him, but because they had, once, hoped the same thing, that God might be gentler than men. Later, his name was scratched from the abbey records, his writings burned, his cell swept clean. But those few words carried by frightened novices into the future would echo where no fire could reach. He believed too much, not in men, not in systems, but in a God who would not ask for screams. And that, in the end, was enough to kill him. They found the ashes at dawn, scattered in silence across the stone rim of the baptismal font. No one saw who did it. The church had been locked from the inside. The sacristan claimed he heard nothing, and the friars, half asleep in their cells, dismissed the scent as smoke from the nearby hearths. But by morning, the air in the nave was thick, not with incense, but with something sharper, something bitter. At first, they said it was soot, that the brazier near the pulpit had spilled its embers overnight. But no one believed it, not really. The ashes were too fine, too pale, too carefully placed. A straight line across the water's surface, like a veil. The priest tried to scoop them out with the silver ladle, muttering Latin with more haste than faith. But even after the surface was clean, the smell remained. It clung to the stone like a warning, and then the infants began to quiet. It was a small village, no more than 30 homes, scattered between the woods and the floodplains. Baptisms were rare, but in the weeks that followed, 3 children were brought into the chapel, squirming, red-faced, lungs full of life, and none of them cried when the water touched their foreheads. No tears, no trembling, just a blank stillness, as if the flame of fear, that primal scream of birth, had been snuffed out before it could spark. The midwives whispered first, that it was not holy water anymore, that something else had taken its place. One of them, old Anna, refused to step inside the church again. She said that she had seen a baby open its eyes after the baptism, but the eyes were wrong, too calm, too quiet, as if the child had seen something it should not have seen. The priest dismissed it as superstition, but even he started wearing gloves when he poured the water, and each morning, before the bells, he checked the font. Always alone, always quickly. No one ever confessed. There was no trial, no stake, no sermon of cleansing, but the story traveled as these stories always do, by candlelight, by spoonfuls of gossip, by silence between breaths. And long after the ashes had been scrubbed clean, no one touched that water without trembling. Because in that village, for a brief season, the ritual that was meant to mark life had begun to smell like death. and not even the smallest among them could escape it. There was no record of fire, no siege to tear the gates down, no foreign banners planted in bloodied soil. Just a fading of breath, like the last ember in a hearth left too long untended. The town was once called something something soft, something in the local tongue that meant hollow of the deer or safe between rivers. But the name does not survive. It was not erased by flame. It was swallowed by silence. Travelers passed the fork in the road and looked the other way. Even the peddlers, who cared more for coin than conscience, stopped marking it on their parchment maps. Not because there was nothing left, but because something still remained, and none of them could explain what it was. They say the bells kept ringing long after the pews were empty, that the choir loft echoed with hymns none remembered teaching, that at night smoke rose from the chimneys, though no one walked the narrow lanes. When a bishop once sent a young priest to restore order there, he returned within 3 days. He said little, only that the host had gone stale the moment he stepped across the threshold, and the crucifix in the chapel had turned its face toward the wall. What happened is not told plainly, not even in whispers. Some say the townsfolk had once harbored a group of condemned heretics, others that a child was buried beneath the altar, unbaptized and unnamed. Others still claim that the townspeople did it to themselves, turning away from Rome and toward something older, colder, and far more patient. Whatever the truth, one thing is certain: those who survived did not stay. They did not carry their possessions with them, only their feet and the will to never speak of home again. When their names were asked in neighboring parishes, they gave only first names. No fathers, no village of origin, just silence. When pressed, some wept, others fled. One woman veiled, with burned palms, was said to utter the same thing each time someone asked where she came from. I was born in a place God forgot, but the church remembered. Today, all that remains is a shallow indentation in the hills where the well once stood. The stones of the chapel have sunk into moss, and the road that once led to its square has bent itself around it, as if the land, too, has chosen not to remember. It is not lost because no one found it. It is lost because no one dares to look. They gathered at dusk, as they always did, not because it brought comfort, but because it was expected. The bells rang out across the valley, trembling on half-broken ropes, echoing through stone walls and hollow stomachs. Mothers carried children with smoke still in their hair. Fathers held hats against their chests like apologies. Even the old widow, the one who no longer remembered her own name, made her way to the edge of the square. Because tonight, there was no excuse. Tonight, everyone had to pray. The man on the stake was young, too young. His fingers still bore the smudges of ink from the monastery scriptorium. His voice had once been heard correcting the priest on matters of grammar. But tonight, he said nothing. His tongue had been cut. The priest raised his arms, not in blessing, but in resignation. The words of the Mass fell from his mouth like stones, heavy and rehearsed. Dominus vobiscum. The crowd answered out of instinct, not faith. Et cum spiritu tuo. But something shifted. A boy at the edge of the crowd misheard the response, or maybe he didn't. Maybe he spoke what he heard in his dreams. He whispered it backward. Or to tipirum ti. His mother slapped the back of his head, hard, but too late. The sound had already carried. A man nearby turned to shush him, but his mouth stayed open. He had heard the words before, in his sleep, in the crackle of firewood, in the screams that rose from the cathedral floors during Holy Week. And then, without instruction, another voice followed. This time an old woman, her mouth trembling, but her tone steady. She repeated the last line of the credo in reverse, her voice like a rusted blade dragging across stone. People turned, unsure whether to silence her or join her. They said if you recite prayers backward, the devil will come. But that night, every word had been spoken correctly. Every ritual followed. every candle lit in perfect order. And still, the boy was condemned. The priest's voice had not wavered, the church had spoken. But no miracle came. No dove, no rain, no sign, just the crackle of dry wood and the slow stink of burning hair. So they began to wonder, if doing it right brought death, what would happen if they did it wrong? Some claimed they only mouthed the prayers in reverse. Others swore they heard Latin splinter into ancient tongues, forgotten even by Rome. One woman claimed the crucifix in her hand grew warm, then hot until she dropped it. A child vomited mid-Ave Maria, and still the fire climbed higher. When the flames reached his face, the young man finally made a sound, not from his mouth, but from the center of his chest. It wasn't a scream. It was a sound no one could name. Later, those who had stayed would say it was the only honest sound of the night. They went home that evening not cleansed, but cursed. And when they prayed afterward, none could tell if they were facing heaven or something far more patient, watching just beyond the veil of their words. After the 50th fire, they stopped coming to Mass. Not officially. Their bodies were still there, hunched under wool cloaks and fraying hoods, kneeling in rows like obedient cattle. The priests still performed the rituals, swung the thurible, lifted the chalice, chanted the words, but the sound no longer carried. It fell flat, like breath against cold stone. No one closed their eyes in devotion anymore. They kept them open, watching the shadows, watching one another, watching the door. The flames had changed something, not just in the town, but in the marrow of the people. What was once faith had hardened into habit, like a song repeated so often it lost meaning. After the 50th body burned, something ancient and unspeakable had been burned away with it: trust. Not in God, but in the men who claimed to speak for him. And yet, no one said it aloud. Instead, they performed belief, the way one performs grief at a stranger's funeral, with the correct gestures, the expected silence, the borrowed sorrow. There was one woman, Marta, the baker's widow, who used to cry every time the bells rang for vespers. Now she laughed, quietly, bitterly. She said the fire had taken her youngest son, not because he was a heretic, but because he'd told the truth. He'd found a page in the priest's Bible that contradicted the sermon, and he'd asked about it. That was enough. Truth had become the most dangerous form of rebellion, not disbelief, not blasphemy, but the quiet audacity of asking why. And so they knelt, and knelt, and waited, some out of fear, some out of habit, some because standing felt like a declaration. But none of them prayed. Not really. They mouthed the words like actors repeating lines for a play that no one wanted to see. They folded their hands not for comfort, but because empty hands were suspicious. In silence, they replayed the crackling screams. In darkness, they remembered the way flesh doesn't burn all at once. In the smoky corners of the nave, children drew shapes in the soot, not crosses, but eyes. Open, watching, unblinking. And when the incense rose, it did not feel holy. It felt like the smoke that had filled the square weeks earlier, the same bitter veil that coated every throat, every memory, every doubt. That smoke had found its way into their hair, their homes, their dreams. It whispered that faith was no longer a light, it was a mask, a shield, a performance staged to avoid becoming the next kindling. Even the priest began to shake when lighting candles, because he too had seen what the fire really consumed. And it wasn't just flesh. Centuries passed, towns changed names, stones crumbled, firewood turned to brick, and belief twisted into doctrine, then habit, then dust. But beneath the cathedral floor, sealed in mildew and wax, wedged between two loose stones behind the altar, a book waited, its spine eaten by time, its cover bloated with rot. No one had meant to preserve it. No decree had ordered it saved. It had simply refused to vanish. Inside, most of the pages were blank. or stained with blood-colored mold. The ink had bled into veins, spidering across parchment like the nerves of a dying animal. But in the middle, exactly halfway through, was a single line, written in a trembling, defiant hand, one that knew it would not be read by friends, one that suspected it might be read only after the writer's breath had long been choked out by smoke. We were not against God. We just didn't know how to fear him the right way. The page held no name, no date, no signature. Just the sentence, as fragile and unsheltered as the people who must have spoken it in whispers, behind locked doors, with the candlewick pinched between wet fingers. It wasn't a protest. It wasn't even a plea. It was a confession carved in shadow, a final attempt to explain the unexplainable, how faith, when twisted by men, can become a terror worse than doubt. The line was quiet, almost apologetic, but not ashamed. It bore the weight of centuries with the tone of a child who had been punished without understanding the rule. That, perhaps, was the most haunting truth of all, that they did believe. But belief wasn't enough. Not when belief didn't come with the correct rituals, or the right silences, or the approved kind of fear. And maybe that's what the fire had truly burned. Not heresy, not rebellion, not evil, but confusion. The kind of confusion that arises when heaven speaks with too many voices, and hell wears the robes of the church. No monument was ever raised for them. No sermon ever acknowledged their names. But the sentence remained, like a breath held too long, like a ghost pressed into parchment. When the historian closed the book, she did not speak. She only ran her hand over the line once more, and felt, in her bones, what those people had died trying to say, that in some corners of history God did not seem like salvation. He only looked like the fire.